lecture is on women's rights ideology. Now, women's rights is definitely going to be a part of a reform movement or part of the reform movements, but I want to go deeper into women's rights ideology. So when you talk about women's rights, when you really start with the American Revolution way back in the 1700s, and the writing of the Constitution, the creation of the United States government, this is where women, a few women, were starting to speak out. And, you know, you have Abigail Adams that said, remember the ladies. And you had Judith Sargent Murray basically saying women are equal beings. So you actually had women speaking out at that point in time. It's just that there were very few of them. They were definitely way before their time, and majority of society, or the majority of society, men and women, really didn't believe in women's rights. So the idea is that women should have the same rights or should have more rights or the same rights really was an ideology back in the 1700s when they were creating the United States of America. And these ideas are definitely coming from the women themselves, but it's also coming from Great Britain, supporting the equality of women. You have a woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft, English, she's from England, around 1792. She wrote about the equality of women, and her writings, her essays are definitely going to be read in the United States and will definitely be, that ideology will definitely be set in some women. Not all, okay? And that's why you only have a few kind of select women in the 1700s that really kind of saw this, you know, this equality issue. Now, we're definitely going to fast forward. It's always been something there, that there have always been some women that have been trying to fight for equality. But once again, it kind of comes in waves. And this is where this kind of another wave comes in, or kind of second wave kind of comes in. And when you're talking about 1800s, you start to see a little bit more of a promotion and ideology of like getting more education for women, and women should be equally educated. Judith Sargent Murray is going to write on this, and you'll see her writings. And so there's this kind of wave. Now, when you come into the reform movements, the women's rights movement or women's rights movement issues will be a part of that reform movement. And there will be this other wave about women basically getting the same rights or having the same rights. And once again, women writers in the 1840s will write about it. A woman by the name of Margaret Fuller will write about women expanding their strengths and issues. She wrote a book, Women in the 19th Century, is the first American book to examine women's society, and it will be sold out. It's a bestseller. So once again, you just have this kind of wave and this voice that's starting to come out in this time period. Another woman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, will be a huge voice, a huge advocate for the women's right to vote. Another one, Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony is a Quaker. She will actually meet up and basically team up with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is married. I believe she has something like 6 kids. And then Susan B. Anthony, never married. She does not have any kids. And they're actually a really good team because they both do writing, okay? But Susan B. Anthony is going to be the speaker. She's going to be the one that's going to travel around the country. She's going to do a lot of speaking engagements. And so she'll be the voice for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She will read some of the essays and some of the writings of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she'll also be talking about her own writing and her own ideology. So actually, they were a really good team at that point in time. Also, so they're doing writing. Susan B. Anthony is going to be doing a lot of speaking, but they're also going to be, in a sense, organizing. They're going to be organizing this movement for the women's rights, but they'll also be speaking about the abolitionist cause. So they will definitely put the two movements together and speak about two movements. Susan B. Anthony will emphasize that suffrage, the right to vote, suffrage involves every basic principle of Republican government. all our social, civil, religious, educational, and political rights. I'm going to repeat that once again. This is from Susan B. Anthony. Suffrage involves every basic principle of Republican government. All our social, civil, religious, educational, and political rights. Another woman who will definitely be a major voice within the women's rights movement is Lucretia Mott, M-O-T-T. Lucretia Mott is a Quaker. She will be outspoken in the abolitionist and the women's rights movement. As I mentioned, she was a Quaker, and her motivation is coming from the religious belief and justice that there should be equality for all, basically justice and equality for all, whether it's men, women, or it doesn't matter your skin color. And so really her momentum is coming from that religious belief that she grew up with within the Quakers. Okay, now, definitely something we have to talk about when you talk about the women's rights movement. Seneca Falls, New York. This is going to be July 19th, 1848. This is going to be it's going to be known as the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention is going to be the first women's rights meeting. It's held in Seneca Falls, and it is going to be attended by men and women, and you'll have approximately 300 people will be there. About 40 men will be a part of the Seneca Falls. They'll have about 3 days meetings where they talk about basically women's rights and they should have equality, and then they will write out what they want. They will write the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and basically saying that women have the same rights. Now, before I get into the meeting and then getting talked about the Seneca Falls meeting, the Seneca Falls Convention began in early 1840. It's going to be women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, I believe it's Lucretia Mott, also William Lloyd Garrison. They're all friends, and they're going to go over to Great Britain, and they're going to go to an anti-slavery abolitionist convention over in London. And so you got to understand, all these people are definitely middle class or wealthy middle class to be able to go to the convention. So these women, and then also William Lloyd Garrison, will go to this meeting. They sail the Atlantic. They'll go to this meeting in London. And at the very beginning, the women were not going to be allowed to go to the convention. And the women are just like, they're totally upset. They're like, oh my God, we traveled all across, the Atlantic Ocean to get here, and you've got to let us in. They basically talk their way in. And they basically get nosebleed seats. And the women are like totally ticked off about it. They're like, hey, we're all basically fighting for the same thing, and we want the information about the abolitionist movement. And the women are so ticked off about it. So the whole convention comes and goes, and then the party basically goes back to the United States. On their journey, on their voyage back to the United States, the women basically will make this pledge that basically they have to fight for women's rights in the United States. And they're like, we should hold a convention. We could basically begin this women's rights movement. And so they make a pledge they're going to do it. Okay, so they get back into the United States, and then what happens. Basically, life happens. And nothing really happens because, Elizabeth Cady Stanton goes back to her home and 6 kids, and they all go back to their busy lives. And so they keep talking about it, right? But they don't necessarily let it go, but they keep talking about it. And so finally, in 1848, they will have this convention that they talked about in 1840. And they're going to have in Seneca Falls because that's where Elizabeth Cady Stanton is, and she's got 6 kids. So it's like, basically let's do it where it would be very convenient for her to do it. And so you have the Seneca Falls Convention. As I said, 300 people will attend. Approximately 40 men will be attending. And there's a lot of speeches. There's a lot of discussion from various women. A few gentlemen will get up and speak. And what they decide to do is that they will basically come together, and they're going to write down their sentiments. Okay, and they're going to basically say what they want and what they've discussed at this convention and what they are wanting and hoping for women. And so they're going to write what's known as the Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments is basically going to basically say that women are equal. Now, another thing about the Declaration of Sentiments is they will take the Declaration of Independence, which is a very important document in American government, and they will basically use that framework of the Declaration of Independence, and they will use it as the framework for their Declaration of Sentiments. So if you look and compare both documents, you will notice that the both documents are basically the same. In a sense, the wording is similar, but they will change the wording basically for women. But when you look at it line for line per line, basically it starts off the same, and they just kind of reword it where it's focusing on women. At the end of the Declaration of Sentiments, or Declaration of Independence, the men who wrote it will sign it, and at the end of the Declaration of Sentiments, those that are at the convention will sign their name to the convention. So they want to show that they are intelligent beings, that they've read and understood the Declaration of Independence, and then they're going to use it as their framework. So it really is trying to show that women are very capable, they're very intelligent, and hopefully it shows that, and then it also goes back to a very important document in the United States. And so you have the Declaration of Sentiments, and it's really there to basically lay the groundwork. The whole convention, Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, is really there to lay the groundwork. And if you're going to build something, you want to basically lay the foundation first. And now every time after the Declaration of Sentiments and Seneca Falls, you don't have to reinvent the wheel because the foundation has already been laid. They're not going to get the right to vote at this period of time. What's going to happen, because it's 1848, the Civil War is going to happen in about a decade. And so people don't even care about the women's rights issue anymore. And so what they've done is they laid the foundation. So after the Civil War, when the women's rights movement gets picked up in the 1870s, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. They can pick up and basically move forward. And that, in a sense, is what's so important about the Seneca Falls Convention. They're basically showing their intelligence, but they're also laying this groundwork, and that's what's so important. Now, not everyone could attend the Seneca Falls Convention, and one example would be Sojourner Truth. She's in Ohio, and it really wasn't practical for her to attend, and so she is going to try to throw her support to the Seneca Falls Convention meeting, and Sojourner Truth is going to give this speech, and it's called "Ain't I a Woman?" And she gives this speech in Akron, Ohio, and it's called "Ain't I a Woman?" And it basically says all the things that she's done in life, and as a slave, and as a woman, and as hard as she has worked. And then she basically says, "Ain't I a woman? All these things that I have done, and this is what women do." And this speech was really written or given in response and in support of the Seneca Falls Convention. All right, now, the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement, 1840 into the 1850s, is going to make a lot of ground. They become more organized. They find a voice. They're really making political ground, okay, in a sense that they're laying the foundation of it. Are they changing politics? No, they're not. But the idea that finding a voice, learning how to organize, organizing, and in a sense becoming, having a political movement, okay, and then creating all that, that is what's so important for the whole women's rights movement. They're really they're taking precedence, and they're creating this precedence of the women's rights movement. Now, as I mentioned before, and I just want to I want to reiterate it, that the civil rights movement, or what happens is in the 1850s, is the United States is going to, it's like a pot bubbling over. The whole slavery issue is just like, it's so tense, and you have this boiling pot of water that's just about to like boil over into the Civil War. And the 1850s is so tense, and everybody's so caught up in this whole slavery, anti-slavery issue, is that the women's rights movement starting to get put on the back burner. And as you get closer and closer to 1860, it's getting put on the back burner even more and more and more. Okay, then the Civil War happens, it explodes, and then obviously that nobody's talking about women's rights right now, and then it'll be picked up in the 1870s when things basically things get settled and life kind of starts to get back to normal. Okay, now I just want to talk about two more issues. When you talk about other issues of women, working women, they're not necessarily involved in all the reform movements. They're not necessarily involved in the women's rights movement or the abolitionist movement. It doesn't mean that they don't care about it. They do care about it. They just don't have the time and the energy to be supportive of it. But the working women are definitely hearing about it. They talk about it, and they definitely are supporting all the various moral reform movements, definitely women's rights. It's just that they can't always, right, participate because they're always working. You will see some like ladies associations involving working women. You'll have the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. You have the Female Labor Reform Association. They're just trying to support one another and maybe try to make changes within labor. Nothing comes of those movements whatsoever, unfortunately. Okay, my last issue that I want to talk about, women in the West. What are women in the West doing? 1820s into the 1850s. Once again, they're definitely going to be involved in reform movements, kind of on their own level. You see a lot of temperance organizations definitely out West. But also, women have a lot to do. There's the homestead movement that basically grants, or you buy land, 80 acres to 160 acres. And so women are moving out there with their families. You'll start to see some associations that will form, a lot of temperance movements will form out. A lot of religious organizations will form, or religious clubs, or just kind of like Bible studies coming from churches. So you see kind of that movement out West. We talked about that. Laws out West, not as restrictive for women. I've already mentioned that before, but once again, you continue to see the laws not quite as restrictive for women out West. Women will definitely work outside the home, as I mentioned last time, just to bring in more money. Another group of people, you see more African Americans moving out West. Either they're running away from slavery, or they've gotten their freedom, and it's just basically a way to get away from the life that they had. So you definitely still see that. Still not an easy life because they don't have equality. Definitely are taking labor jobs, low-paying labor jobs. You see a lot of them working as cooks or laundresses. They also might be working as like domestic servants, or even like a domestic servant within like a boarding house or a hotel. They would kind of be the maids and cleaning up after that. Working in restaurants. An example, I have two examples of women. A woman by the name of Black Ann. Black Ann was a cook on a steamboat, and she was able to buy all her children out of slavery. So she basically saved all the money she had, and that was to buy her children out of slavery. Another woman, Elizabeth Eakins, she is in Indiana. She will be able to buy land and establish a farm in Indiana, and ran a farm. I don't have a whole lot to go on, except for the fact that she was, I would say, like middle class, like comfortable middle class. And I really don't have a whole lot. But if you think of it in a bigger perspective, that is actually that's huge for her, because you rarely see African Americans own land, let alone a woman. And she actually is farming and making a profit farming. So that is actually a very positive thing. Okay, now one other group that I want to mention is Asians. And the reason why I say Asians out west is that it can be different groups coming from Asia. And when you talk about 1850 and a little bit before 1850, it's mainly Chinese. Chinese are coming over for the gold rush. The gold rush in California will be in 1848 through early 50s. And so you will see Chinese come into the United States. Um, when you are talking, when you're talking Chinese come for the gold rush, it's mainly men. But then once the men get established in California, they will send over for wives, or they'll send over for what's known as mail order brides. And so you will start to see a few women coming into California. Where they tend to live and make a life tends to be in San Francisco. As we know, there's a very large and complex Chinatown in San Francisco. Also the Monterey area. You'll also see eventually, kind of in the LA area, they'll also have a strong, vibrant Chinatown. Now, when you talk about women, Chinese women coming over into the United States, they worked as laborers. They worked as cooks, laundresses, shopkeepers, sometimes domestic servants, kind of domestic servants that are kind of behind the scenes. But also you will see, unfortunately, a lot will go into prostitution. So I just kind of want to touch briefly on women who are out in the West. Okay, that was definitely a shorter lecture, and that'll be it, and there'll be more lectures to come.